Most startups play by the old rules and lose, but the biggest winners, they rewrite the game entirely.
A startup doesn't win by doing any of those things. A startup wins by changing the subject.
Even the smartest founders with perfect business plans hit the wall.
So I saw this happen all the time. I saw most likely to succeed startups fail miserably or just go nowhere.
While others with broken servers and no clear leadership somehow won. The difference isn't execution. It's not timing. It's this.
Better doesn't matter with startups. You have to be radically different to make a difference.
Mike Maples Jr. learned this the hard way after missing billion-dollar opportunities hiding in plain sight.
The only way I'm going to succeed is if I offer a radical new form of empowerment that forces a choice and not a comparison.
The next inflection is already here. The question is, will you see it?
I think that great startup ideas come from living in the future before others do.
Stop competing, start dominating.
Specificity is a superpower.
Discover the Pattern Breakers framework that's reshaping how the smartest VCs spot the next unicorn. Full episode, now on EUVC Podcast.
This was their finest hour.
Tear down this wall.
It's more than just an alliance. This is a union of values.
Let's start acting.
This show is not investment advice, and the hosts of this episode may be invested in the funds and companies featured.
Welcome back, my friends, to another episode of the EUVC podcast. I hope by now this is your home for connecting and championing the builders of European tech. Today's episode is one that I have been counting down the days for. We're joined by none other than Mike Maples Jr., a voice who has truly shaped how an entire generation of VCs think about inflections, movements, and the power of convictions. There's no one that has probably formed my thinking as much as Mike has. So I'm looking very much forward to diving in today. We'll explore the frameworks behind Pattern Breakers, Mike's recent book, but work you've been working on, I think, almost as long as Floodgate has existed. We'll, of course, dive into how it informs your strategy and also how it informs Europe and how you think about Europe and what Europe looks like when viewed through this lens. We're talking everything from capital formation to LP psychology, policy, and geopolitics. Mike, let's get right into it. I've long admired your thinking, as I just said. Now, tell me about yourself and Pattern Breakers, how it came to be.
Yeah, well, hey, thanks for all the kind words, and hopefully I'll have something to offer. I know it's a very European sort of audience here. Where did Pattern Breakers come from? It kind of came from an unsettling realization. So I was 10 years into doing seed investing, and one day I noticed that something like 80 to 85% of my exit profits had come from pivots. You know, I talk about this a little bit in the book Pattern Breakers, but it's even worse than the book describes. So with Twitch, I had invested in Justin TV, and about 5 years in, they say, great news, we've pivoted. We're two companies now. We're Social Cam and we're Twitch. And I thought, okay, the reason they did that is nobody's going to want to watch people play video games. So Social Cam is the real company. And at the time, Vidi was a hot startup. So then Social Cam gets bought for $65 million. And I just forgot about Twitch. You know, I wasn't a user. And so one day I noticed that Amazon is thinking about buying Twitch for close to $1 billion. And I'm like, man, you know, is that Justin TV? And I reached out to Emmett Shear and said, hey, just doing some clerical accounting work, you know, just want to verify how many shares I've got. What do you think? What does your numbers say? And so I didn't even have Twitch on my books. So you can imagine, I'm talking to my LPs. I'm like, okay, I got some good news, bad news. The good news is, we'll start with that. We just made 90 times our money on this investment in Twitch. The bad news is I haven't put it in any of my financial reports, and I'm embarrassed, and that's not how I like to do things. So, you know, if you need me to restate my financials, I can. We'll work something out. And every single LP was like, nope, we're good. Just send us the money. This is awesome. You know, people send me champagne and stuff. But like I came away from that thinking, just what business am I even in? Because like that same week, I'm helping a founder shut down a company that had done all the right stuff. You know, they'd defined their culture. They had used the business model canvas. They would have been a Harvard Business School case study, except for the fact that they'd failed, right? And I don't know, this may resonate with you and some of your listeners, right, who invest in seed rounds, but this wasn't a one-off for me. I saw this happen all the time. I saw most likely to succeed startups fail miserably or just go nowhere. And I saw, like the Twitter guys couldn't decide who the CEO was, couldn't keep the servers working, but it didn't matter because people wanted to tweet. And it just but there weren't any best practices that I could discern, in the early days. So that was the genesis of the Pattern Breakers thinking was, okay, what's going on here? Should I just retire because it's random and I'm going to get exposed? Or is there something happening below the surface that, yes, there's some chance for sure, but it's not all an accident? That led me on this kind of rabbit hole, multiple year quest to kind of figure out what's going on here. And the ideas of Pattern Breakers are my attempt to answer those questions.
And maybe let's lay out that framework. So if I just put my context in there, I started in venture and on the investment side, direct investment side, and then I helped build a fund. And then I realized there's a lot of in this framework thinking that can also be applied as an LP when I was later involved in LP investing and still am. And I thought there's so much here that can be used to understand how any VC should be or is thinking about, and whether they're truly thinking about breakout companies or they're betting on the next iteration of something that's already out there. Maybe you can talk a bit about that. And I don't know if you think that's a good setup, but at least that's how I think about it.
I think so. So here's how I would internalize it, Andreas, is that startup capitalism is a fundamentally different kind of capitalism. So most people, when they talk about capitalism, they talk about defensible moats and compounding advantages and all the Michael Porter's 5 forces, Hamilton Helmer's 7 powers. And you realize that a startup has none of that stuff. They only have the founders and their ideas. And so a startup doesn't win by doing any of those things. A startup wins by changing the subject. So a startup capitalist wins when they refuse the premise of the rules and impose a new heretical set of different rules, and then get the world to agree with their idea, their heresy, and then move the future into a different direction. And so that's what it reminds me of in evolution. You look at the fossil record, the fossils look the same for a long time, and then you have punctuated equilibrium, like a flood or an asteroid or something. The startup capitalist job is to create punctuated equilibrium. It's to challenge the current frame and propose a new frame. So the ideas in Pattern Breakers then are, how do you do that? How do you change the subject? How do you deny the premise of the rules? You start with inflections, and an inflection is a change event that creates a new form of empowerment. The startup needs the inflection because we want to wage asymmetric warfare on the present. We're not interested in having a fair fight. We want to have an unfair fight that's to our advantage. And then the insight is, okay, so what? How does this inflection let me do something that's non-consensus and right? One company we invested in was Lyft back in the day. The inflection was the iPhone 4S had a GPS chip in it. And you could have had the idea for ride sharing before that. It wouldn't have mattered because you could have implemented ride sharing. But now all of a sudden, there's a window of opportunity where for the first time, you could implement ride sharing, but you had to have an insight, right? You couldn't just be aware of the fact that that chip was in the phone. You had to say, hey, this thing in my pocket, there's a new form of empowerment that could be unlocked in special ways. And so ride sharing would be an embodiment of how to unlock that empowerment. DoorDash was another type. Instacart was another type. But none of those things could have existed before you had smart chips that could locate people in real time. So the inflection is the thing that happens outside of the startup, and the insight is the thing that happens in the mind of the founder. It's the creative source of inspirational breakthrough that causes them to propose a heretical different future. What I started to realize is that better doesn't matter with startups. You have to be radically different to make a difference. And what was happening, and the reason that some of the people who did all the right things didn't succeed, is they bought into a context. They bought into the rules as they were defined by the incumbents. And so they were limited to playing in the incumbent sandbox. And so when you play in the incumbent sandbox, there's only a small part of the territory of that sandbox that's going to be offered to you. You're going to always have an incrementally upsided opportunity. What you want to do is escape competition entirely by harnessing these inflections and having a non-consensus and right insight. You want to force, like maybe we can drill down on this, but I say you want a product that forces a choice and not a comparison. You want to escape the comparison trap entirely, because comparison is death for a startup, right? Like you want to be something that can't be reconciled with anything that's come before.
Let me then ask you, because you have different forms of inflections. You have the adoption inflection, the technological inflections, the societal inflections. How widely do you go here? Do you think it's even relevant to talk about this nomenclature, or is it just an inflection point in whatever axis that is significant enough to create a radical change in time, so to say, for the founder to then be able to take off?
Yeah. So what I realized is that the best use of it was sanity checking a current idea. So when I talk to founders, they don't lack for ideas. What they really are interested in is, should I pursue this idea? Does it have enough upside? And my response to that usually has been, how should I know, right? I'm not a customer. I'm not the genius that you are. I haven't invented the thing that you've invented. But what I realized was that there are some diagnostic questions that you can ask. And one diagnostic question is, what inflection are you harnessing? What is the new type of empowerment that only recently has become available? And how are you harnessing it in a way that creates massive empowerment that people will be desperate for? If somebody says to me, I can't think of an inflection, I'm like, okay, you still may have one and you just haven't thought of it that way yet. Or maybe you just don't have one. Maybe you have a plausibly good sounding idea that's not that good. And so, the most dangerous ideas, like back in the day, Sarah Leary, who's a good friend of mine, started a company with Nirav Tolia called Fanbase before they started Nextdoor, social network for sports fans. That's one of the most dangerous ideas you could do, because everybody's going to tell you it makes sense. Everybody knows sports, everybody knows social networks. And so you go talk to 10 people and they'll say, hey, that sounds like a great idea. I think you should do that idea. The problem is there was no desperate people for a social network for sports fans, or at least the way they defined it. A market that sounds plausibly good with zero desperate people is a failed startup. And so, the inflection allows you to kind of sanity check and say, the only way I'm going to succeed is if I offer a radical new form of empowerment that forces a choice and not a comparison. And the only way I can offer such empowerment is to harness something powerful, right? And the inflection allows you to ask, what is the empowering thing? What's the empowering thing that's bigger than me or any startup or any company for that matter? Because otherwise you have no weapon, right? You have no weapon to wage an unfair battle against the present.
Yeah, and to bridge from your starting story with Twitch, where you didn't even realize that this was actually the company, to today, where you're radically successful and have formed this framework. You had a period where you went out and did a bunch of research. Yes. Maybe talk a bit about that, just for everyone to know the context here.
Yeah. So one of the challenging things about researching success is that even the successful people themselves can misremember how it really happened. When something works out, you remember knowing things that weren't so at the time. You have to be very thoughtful about the questions that you ask. So let's say that you're talking to Mark Pincus at Zynga. You can't say, why do you think Zynga was successful? Because he has a story in his mind about why it was successful. And it may be 100% true. It might not be true. But what you want to do is you want to say, hey, can you show me the seed pitch deck for Zynga? And I notice that in this seed pitch deck, Farmville isn't in it. So what's up with that? Like, what happened with Farmville? Like, what caused you to decide to do that? And so you want to get it out of the realm of value judgment, and you want to just get the facts, right? You just want to say, what was the difference between what you thought it was and what it turned out to be? And what caused you, what surprises did you notice along the way that caused you to shift in whatever direction you shifted in, or maybe you didn't shift. But like what you're trying to do is objectively as possible, figure this out. And what I also realize about the inflections is it's the best answer I've ever found for the why now question. Because the inflection, it's kind of like a Goldilocks moment. If you try to implement an empowering insight before the inflection happens, you lack sufficient empowerment to deliver that. If you wait for too long, it becomes obvious to people. And now you're going to be playing the comparison game. So there's this window of time where you seize upon the inflection with your insight. Because timing is such a critical, ephemeral factor in this, to me, the inflection theory was powerful in that regard, right? It was a powerful heuristic, if you will, to kind of judge a startup idea, either as an investor or a founder.
And then let me ask you, Mike, and this is, of course, the secret sauce or whatever, or your framework and how you think about things. But I'd love to ask you, how do you, when you're meeting a seed founder now, how do you apply the framework to understand where they are? And here, our audience are primarily GPs and LPs that listen to understand how GPs work. I'd love to understand, how do you apply it in that first meeting? How do you apply it in the preparational work before even meeting them? How is it enacted inside Floodgate?
We're definitely focused on what is the real insight here. Most people, if you ask them what is their insight, they'll answer in some form of, the world needs my product. That's my insight. And so it becomes a tautology. So the question then becomes, how do you know if it is a real insight, if they come by it honestly? And I'd say my favorite cheat code for that is to ask, what future are you living in? And so I don't think that great startup ideas come from trying to think of a startup. I think that great startup ideas come from living in the future before others do. When you live in the future, you experience the inflections firsthand. So vision is not about your thought process for what the change is. Vision ought to be a verb. Vision is really more about getting your hands dirty with it. It's about your lived experience with what's new. And by having a lived experience with what's new, you learn what's new about it. You learn how the inflections create new empowering conditions that will change how people think, feel, and act, because you yourself are experiencing it. But then you also start to realize what you're bumping up against. What are the limits of how it works? That's where I think the best insights come from, getting out of the present and living in a valid future, and then building what's missing in that future. And so that's what I really look for in a first meeting. And then the other part of it is more, do they have the stuff to convince the world? So you have to not just think different, but you have to act different. Brian Chesky, who I unfortunately did not invest in, was selling cereal boxes to fund the company. And looking back on it, that was much more of a feature than a bug. Justin Kahn was doing a live reality show of his life, and the prior company he'd started, he sold on eBay. And so you look at stuff like that and you say, wow, these people are going to run plays that aren't in anybody's playbook, because they have the same type of creativity and generative philosophy in terms of their actions as they do in terms of their ideas. And so, it's hard to get people to move to a different future. It takes great persuasion skills. It takes great resilience and grit. It takes a long-term perspective. And so I'd say that that's the other part of it, right? They can't just have a superior logic about the future. They have to have the ability to emotionally move us to a vision of a different world, to get us to want to move somewhere different directionally.
And now, Mike, let me tie us into another point where you are, I don't know if I should call it radically different from many other VCs, but at least where you are very opinionated and you take the consequences, which is you have a strong conviction in first ticket investing. You have typically 30% follow-on and 70% in the initial check. That's a lot more in the initial check than most VCs do in their models. I know, of course, that this ties into how you're thinking and the importance of understanding the inflection in the beginning, but I'd love to hear you square this.
Yeah, so the way I think about it is, most venture firms, even the best ones, if you looked at the return on dollars from the first check they write and the return on dollars from their follow-on checks, most firms are scandalously bad. Like if venture firms were required to report that in their audited financials, some of the LPs would be, surrounding firms with pitchforks, and demanding change because it's just so outrageous. So I'm like, okay, that's interesting. Most people have terrible follow-on returns checks relative to their first checks. Not everybody, but most. So then you say to yourself, should I ever write a follow-on check if that's true? And I think that the answer is yes, occasionally you should, because pro rata rights are a right. They're worth something. They're not worth zero. And so the question is, when do you pursue your pro rata rights? Because the trick in succeeding in investing in anything else is to understand where you have a comparative advantage, is to understand when you have options to make money that other people don't have. And in seed investing, the option to make money that other people don't have is to have better insight, is to see things that other people don't see. And to be a good seed investor, I would assert you have to be good at that. Otherwise, you shouldn't even be doing it in the first place. So then on the follow-on side, the question becomes, when are pro rata rights an opportunity to play offense with your money? And so, if Benchmark decides to fund Twitter, do you exercise your pro rata rights? Well, over time, I started to realize you probably do. If you think that Peter Fenton is a discerning, smart investor and you think Twitter is a good company, because nobody else gets to do that but you and the other early investors. So that's how I look at it. So that's point one. Point two about returns is, and I learned this from Dave Swenson, your allocation model matters a lot. So like if you're an endowment, how much you put in private equity, how much you put in public stocks, how much you put in cash, how much you put in bonds, and whatever else your mix is, domestic, international, that defines your return profile as much as any single decision that you make. And I started to realize that your decision about 70-30, 60-40, 50-50 is the VC equivalent of your allocation strategy. And so I'll give you an example. Like in Fund 1, we were 70% upfront, 30% follow-on. Fund 2, we were 50-50. Fund 1 had a lower return on first checks than Fund 2. But so far, Fund 1 has a higher absolute return. So you think about that, you could have made no other different decisions, right? You could have made, you didn't add value differently to any of the companies. You didn't pick the companies any differently. Just that one decision of 70-30 versus 50-50, Fund 2 would have had another 2x multiple on top of what it already did. So I think right now Fund 2 is something like 7 or 8x. It would have gotten probably to 10x had we done 70-30. And that's real money, right? And you didn't have to work harder. You just had to decide better. You just had to see better. And so that, to me, is the other logic here, is there's an amount of follow-on dollars that you want to have to play offense with your money, but you want to have that minimum viable amount, not the maximum viable amount. You don't want to cover up the sins of your bad investments by doubling down on the losing companies.
When you said play offense with your follow-on money, you did also describe a case where you have Peter Fenton wanting to come in at a radically higher valuation and so on in the next round. So meaning strong signal from the outside. Is this the only case where you will do it, or will you, and let's talk about governance as well, because you have a very different model than others as well, which I've been advocating to so many here, saying, why do you not have a single partner running the follow-on investing? Why do you have it? And then they say, well, we have all the knowledge and blah, blah. Yes, but you also have all the bias. So let's talk
exactly. You end up knowing things that aren't so, right? Like, so if you buy the premise that follow-on versus upfront is an allocation model question, then you have to ask yourself, okay, what are the governance implications of that answer? Our view was that we should have a partner that's dedicated to making follow-on investment decisions. And so we have Iris Choi, who's now been at Floodgate for close to 15 years. And Iris is like, okay, I'm going to be held accountable for these returns. And so I need to have absolute decision rights about whether we make this investment or not. That's how it works. So Iris decides our follow-on checks. Now, if let's say that I want to put in another 50 to 100K to, help the company, bridge the company, do whatever need to do, I'm free to do that. But that comes out of my first check budget. And there's an opportunity cost for me, right? If I put 100K into a company that's not working to keep it alive and keep the plate spinning, that's 100K I don't have to invest in the next Applied Intuition or the next, whatever great company is coming down the pike. And so what you want is you just want clarity around who decides and under what circumstances. Iris decides to play offense with our money. That's her job. And if she doesn't think that we could play offense with our money, she won't advocate investment. But there are times, by the way, she'll say, Applied Intuition I just mentioned, after we did the Series A, she said, I think this is a great company. I think Kasser Yunus is a great CEO. I would own as much of this company as I can, any way that I can. And so she started buying up, right? She started buying super pro rata in the early rounds because she's like, my job is to play offense with our money. And so I need to take advantage of the fact that we're in some good companies whenever I can. And there's not that many companies that move the needle in a fund, right? And so whenever there is one that I think has that potential, I got to go unbelievably all in.
Tell me just one thing. When you have a single partner that plays offense with the follow-on money, why do you not also carve it out to be its own fund?
The reason I think that I wouldn't is you have to, so pro rata rights only exist if you made the upfront investment, right? So
okay, so it's to keep the right inside the firm and not have that discussion about it going to the opportunity fund.
That's right. So we used to debate this early on. We're like, should we create an opportunity fund? And I realized we already have an opportunity fund. It's called Floodgate Fund 7. And what we should be doing is we should be allocating the dollars in Fund 7 to the best use of those dollars. And, you do an opportunity fund, it creates its own center of gravity pressure to invest it. And so I was like, we don't want that, right? What we should instead be asking is Fund 8, which we'll probably raise, next year, do we want it to stay 70-30 or should be 80-20 or 50-50 or, 60-40 or whatever? And it should be a function of the circumstances and our belief of the dynamics of the market and the valuations and, power law outcomes and that kind of stuff.
Mike, I'm in two worlds or two minds here because on the one hand, I really want to get to some policy talk, but I also think that you're one of the strongest thinkers on fund size, especially because you can actually come from a point of integrity and say, stay small. So I do think we need to just touch on that. It's a constant conversation in the GP and LP circles. So of course, do you go large or do you not? So tell me why you think it's so important that you stay small.
Yeah, well, so the way I look at it, Andreas, is your fund size is your strategy. So if I want to know what a firm's strategy is, there's only one question I need to ask. How big is your fund? And people could say whatever they want to say, but your fund size is your strategy because it dictates everything that matters. It dictates what is your canonical investment size. It dictates what type of return are you expecting in the winning companies. So it almost reminds me of if you've ever seen the Olympics when they try to qualify for the decathlon and they put a bar up and you got a pole vault over the bar. And if you're not careful, you can no height. You could be disqualified before you even get into the Olympics because you put the bar too high too soon and don't clear it. And so to me, your fund size is a promise that you're making to your LPs about how much exit profits you're going to have in your best fund investment. Let's say I want to have a 5X fund. I have to have one investment that likely returns 2.5 times the fund by itself. And so if my fund is under $50 million, what that looks like is really different than if it's $1 billion or $5 billion. So I think that's the first thought. The second thought, Andreas, is a little more subtle. So one way I look at it is, what does it mean to be a good venture capitalist? So if you're investing in public stocks, you'd say, I want to outperform the market by some percent. I think in startups, there's what I call 20 baggers and 100 baggers. a 20 bagger is an investment where you make 20 times your money on the first check. And that's not 20 times the valuation. That's 20 times price per share, right? All dilution factored in. And then a 100 bagger is where you make 100x or more on your first check. And if you want to be great, you want to get 20 baggers about 15% of the time. And if you want to be superlative, you want to get 100 baggers about 5% of the time. And so I'm like, my business is hard, but not complicated. It's in the 15% case that I'm right. Am I 20 bagger right or 100 bagger right? Enough of the time that it matters. It's interesting because if you look at the best funds, and I've asked our LPs to help us out with this, the batting average is not that different between the very best funds and the mediocre to bad funds. I mean, horrible funds are just horrible at everything, right? But even good funds versus great funds, the difference is less a function of the percentage of losses and much more of a function of how big was the upside when they were right. And so that's how I look at it. So why does that matter? It focuses the mind, right? Like people say, does valuation matter or not matter? I'm like, well, it matters to the extent that you want to make 20 times on the first check. And if the valuation's higher, it takes a higher exit for you to achieve that. And so what people don't understand about valuation is valuation and risk are one-to-one correlated, because if you pay twice the price, you only get paid half as much for the risk you took. And so and investing is getting paid for the risk you take defined, right? That's what investing is. And so that's why I like this sort of 100 bagger, 20 bagger construct. And, I have a database of 100 bagger startups, and I try to understand what was true about them that wasn't true about most companies. And you could drift into survivorship bias, but I still think it's valuable to study those companies and develop your mental models around them and stress test them and, see if you're making sense when you think about those companies.
Tell me, Mike, because you are in your day job a full-time GP, only doing directs. Most that get to your level in the venture industry also end up doing some LP investments. So I'd love to just ask you, do you do any LP investments? And if so, do you apply this framework? And if you don't, then tell me, do you think the framework and using your framework to understand how a VC thinks about investing is worthwhile?
Yeah, generally speaking, I don't. If Benchmark or Sequoia say, hey, do you want to invest? I'd look at that pretty seriously, right? Or like Hummingbird Ventures, in Europe, Founders Fund. But there's a lot of small funds where I try to be helpful, but I try to be credibly neutral. And you run into this problem over time where if you invest in too many of these, you kind of got to be in all of them, or you got to be, in none of them. Because if you're in just a small number, people think that you have a bias or that you're prefer.
So you're afraid of its effect on your main business, so to say.
Yeah. So I for the most part, I'm like, look, I've got enough exposure to early stage, crazy, risky stuff already at Floodgate. Every extra nickel I get, I should be putting in index funds or, something super low risky.
Tell me, do you have your LPs asking you or battle testing some of their own thoughts, not on funds, but on how they think about venture as an asset class? I'm super curious about this because to me, it seems like a good way to pressure test a VC, how they think, because I do think that the big problem or the big difference between someone who will be massively successful or someone who will not is, are they able to spot the right time of a startup? Because there's a lot of good ideas out there. The question is, do they capture an inflection in the market or in the technology or whatever that allows them to then ride with the right one and not the ones that had the GPS and a phone idea before it was possible?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I sort of have this view that it's really important to pick your LPs to the extent that you can, because you want to have the kind of relationship where you can tell them the truth with no tricks. And so there have been times, right, where I thought we're not doing as good of a job as we could. And I wanted to be able to go to Dave Swenson at Yale and say, look, I don't think we've done as well as we could in these circumstances. Here's what I think we need to fix. Am I making sense? And I don't want to be worried about, oh, what's Dave Swenson going to think? Is he going to give up on me? Blah, 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 this and that. Like, I want to just, like, they may decide they want to work with us in the future. They may not decide to work with us in the future. But I want it to be based on valid logic. I want it to be because they had the facts and they made a good choice and we made a good choice, but I don't want to hold things back, right? And it reminds me of when a startup works with lighthouse customers. I like to say, you should tell them the truth with no tricks. That's what we try to do. We're perfectly happy. In fact, I was hanging out with the Medley guys at a social event a few months ago, and we had an exit, and it was kind of a unexpected upside quickly happened. And I'm like, what do you guys think about how much we should distribute? And what do you guys think about should we recycle and all that? And maybe we'll do exactly what they want us to do. Maybe we won't. But like, I just want to be able to have the discussion and not worry about how I'm going to position it to them and, all that stuff. I'd much rather just say, hey, look, you're seeing the sausage be made with me here. But that's what it means to be partners. That's what we're in it for. My model doesn't work for everybody. I don't think it would work if you raised multiple billions of dollars. I think that our model only works if your entire LP base can be in one room when you have your annual meeting, and our room's not that big, right? And so that's just how we look at it. Phil Horsley back in the day at Horsley Bridge showed me this thing he had called the Grand Slam study, and he told me how many Grand Slams there were as a function of all the investments that had happened. All these LPs have shared with me data about, they've anonymized the funds, but they've shared about vintages and exit sizes and timing and all these kinds of things. And it's really helped me understand, just the physics of what a great startup looks like. And as to what degree does it change over time? To what degree is it constant over time? I'm very grateful that I never have to ask myself, what am I going to say to the LPs about this? I just say, hey, here it is, right? Let it rip and let the chips fall.
I think that's the best approach. At least you want some of your LP base like that. No matter whether you're massively successful or not, you got to have some that can give you that perspective and you can have that trust with. Mike, now I want to go to policy. And I want to talk partly, and we only have 12 minutes left, but I want to talk to you both about a bit your take on Europe and some of the things you're seeing here in Europe. And then I also want to tap your brain a bit on what's going on in the US. And I want to let's start on the last part. So in Europe, if I just set the context here, in Europe, there's a lot that don't really understand what's going on in the tech ecosystem in the US, meaning they do see it happening. They do see that it seems like every VC and founder has come behind the new administration. But at the same time, to them, it seems like madness. And they are appalled by it, and I don't know what. I'd love to ask you, explain it to us as we were 5-year-olds. What's going on here?
My answer may be unsatisfying and satisfying at the same time. So one of the things that my dad taught me was the notion of keep your tribalist instincts small. And by that, what he meant was when you over-affiliate with any tribe, whether it's Republican, Democrat, EU versus US, whatever the case may be, you start to force yourself into the position of adopting stupid ideas of the tribe. And so you force yourself to defend ideas that you wouldn't defend if your tribal footprint was small. And so, I'll give you an example. Let's suppose that you say to me, what's wrong with the crummy U.S. food supply? It seems like whenever people go to the U.S., they gain weight and they can't even understand. And it must be because they got chemicals in the food and it's all screwed up. If you say that to me, I have a choice. I can be offended. I could say, oh, yeah, well, screw you. And Europe does this and blah, blah, that. Or I could say, you know what? It's not Andreas's problem if our food supply is screwed up. It's my problem. And so I can either decide that I care about that and that it's worth considering and do something about it. I should thank you for bringing it up, right? Because, it's in my interest to not have a crummy food supply. But when you get your tribalism caught up in it, you get into this tit for tat kind of thing. Oh yeah, well, tariffs this and policies that, and immigration this and whatever. So like I try really hard to just say, okay, what is the specific topic that we're talking about here? First of all, do I even care? Does it affect me at all? And then if it does, what should I do about it? And so that's kind of how I see it. There may be questions you have about what's going on in U.S. politics. I just don't have answers for because I don't care that much, right? I'm just not thinking about it.
Let me ask you one follow-up question then, because you say keep your tribalism in check. At the same time, when I look at the U.S., I think that there's part of the U.S. VC tech founder playbook that we in Europe can learn a lot from. And that is the involvement in policy and actually daring to also take a side. And I say that because, well, when you pick a side, then you've definitely also adopted a set of tribalist views. But I think it's so important that we as a VC ecosystem dare to do it, because to use your nomenclature, and I have done this often when talking about this, VCs and tech founders are living in the future. There's no one who spent as much time thinking about the most powerful force shaping society than VCs and tech founders, because that today is tech. And for that reason, I think we have a social responsibility to get involved in politics. Yeah. I'd love to ask you, what's your take here? Because it kind of puts you on the other side where you have to pick a tribe.
Yeah. So that, and this, keep in mind, this is keeping tribalism small. So like, for example, if you said to me, I think European entrepreneurs and VCs have a lot to learn from US VCs and entrepreneurs, I would tend to push back against that. I would tend to say there's great entrepreneurs throughout the world. Like, I think that Daniel Ek at Spotify is a freaking stud. And like, when I study the art of nailing an early niche effectively and precisely, Spotify is the best example case I can come up with. And when I met him, right, and interviewed him for the podcast, I was super excited because I'm like, this guy is a kindred spirit. I don't care where he's from. If I'm in any tribe at all, I'm in his tribe, whatever that is energetically, not location wise, energetically. And so I can learn from Daniel Ek. I can learn from Danny Reimer, right, who's in the UK. There are great people throughout this world that we can learn from. And that's what I try to do, right? So like, if I'm trying to learn from US VCs, I don't think of them as a group. I think of Mike Moritz, Bruce Dunleavy, Peter Fenton, people that, Hans Tung, people that I respect, Roger Ehrenberg, people that I think are talented that I can learn from specifically. And so to me, it's not so much learning from Americans or whatever. For me, it's like Europe is the crucible of civilization. It's like, pattern breakers, a lot of people from Europe were the original pattern breakers. Part of what makes me sad, for example, some of the speech stuff that I'm seeing in the UK, is not to diss on the UK. It's just, I'm like, what would John Locke say? What would John Stuart Mill say about this? It was your ideas, right? It was your ideas that you're going against. It was pattern breaking in art, Picasso with Cubism, right? Like you look at like some of the most groundbreaking consequential ideas in human history, they came from Europe. And that's not a tribal statement. That's just a fact. That is an objective truth. So I'm like, okay, what my hope for people in Europe is not for their tribe to succeed versus mine. My hope is that we're kindred spirit, sovereign individuals, and that, Europeans, just like Americans, stand up for their sovereign individuality, right? In whatever way they can to make the future better. And if that means engaging in politics in the right places, so be it. But like, I don't know, like, I think that there's so much that Europe has contributed to humanity and civilization that there's a part of me that thinks there's an inner knowing that Europeans have that they need to rediscover. And they don't need to, I look at my lattice of mental models, and, the majority of them come from people that were Europeans. And so I'm like, there's a lot of good potential there. And, I want people in Europe to remember who they are, right? Not to try to be more like us in any way.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And I often take a bit of offense at the discussion around European ambition or European founders' ambitions, because I always say, well, you typically hear that from people that at the same time also hold true that a founder is someone who will run through walls, whatever is in front of them. And if that is the case, how can it also be true that your ambition would be lower because you're from a social welfare state or something like that? So European ambition, I have never seen a problem with. Can we have problems with fragmentation, over-regulation, so on? Yes, absolutely. But there's nothing wrong with the ambition level.
Right. And I'm like, so this is another thing that I really believe about startups. Specificity is a superpower. So like if a founder pitches me and they say, okay, here's my ICP, I'm like, there's no such person in the world named ICP. There's no such person in the world named persona. So can you give me one specific person, could be anybody you want, that got specific value from your product in a specific way, and tell me exactly what happened? So if somebody says, what's European ambition? I say, okay, is Daniel Ek ambitious? Because last time I checked, he's pretty ambitious. I tend to push back on questions that overgeneralize. I tend to say we're all people of free will, and we all get to decide what we want to do with the gift of our time. Choose wisely. And, if there's things blocking us from living the best life we can, we should try to unblock those things. But like I try to get out of the generalities and the tribalism stuff, because it clouds my judgment.
Yeah, I think that's very wise. You have a thunder lizard behind you and a book that says Practice Reckless Optimism. I think that is very beautiful to close on, just pointing out the importance of this. Before we close, I also want you to just pitch for a second your Starting Greatness podcast, because I think it's incredibly important. And to any founders, especially listening, it's incredibly good. I have never heard anyone, like I always say, the startup curriculum for someone wanting to get into the world of startups is that podcast, not the interviews if you don't have too much time, but you really want a real curriculum. It's your digests where you do 10-minute or 5-minute or 7-minute core learnings and frameworks pulled out from a big conversation with some of the most successful founders in the world. Incredible content, Mike. I am so thankful you've contributed this to the world AI model.
Well, thanks. Yeah. And I ended up renaming it to Pattern Breakers Podcast.
Yes, now it's Pattern Breakers. I can't get out of that. Sorry. It's 5 years ago.
No, it's all good. It's fine. But that was what I realized was that there's not a lot of people talking about mental models for startup and 0 to 1. There wasn't, you could look at Charlie Munger's models, and I was like, why hasn't anybody applied that amount of rigor to startup capitalism? And so that was my real goal. And then I also saw there's just so many blogs and so many podcasts and so much noise that I wanted to just put my own stamp of opinion of what are some of the timeless, counterintuitive lessons that the ambitious founders can learn. And so I try to interview people like Daniel Ek and try to tease out from him some of the things we can really learn and that some of the durable lessons, not just Spotify, but beyond. So hopefully it's useful, people. I'm not making any money on it, that's for sure. And so it's I just get out episodes when I can, and just it's kind of a side hustle, I suppose. It's side hustle with no money, just like my book, pretty much.
Mike, you've done it better than anyone else, so I thank you so much for it. It was such a help for me in the beginning, and I still return to it, especially when I talk to people wanting to get into the industry. Thank you so much for joining me today, Mike. It really means a ton to have brought you on the podcast. Well,
thanks for having me. It means a lot that anybody in Europe would have any interest whatsoever in what I have to say. So, hopefully I haven't taken any steps backward in that regard.
In no way. Thank you so much, Mike.
All right, thanks.
This was their finest hour.
Tear down this wall.
It's more than just an alliance. This is a union of values.
Let's start acting.